What's up, YouTube? Will Gwyn here with No Beat is Safe Entertainment, and this is my new series called The Science of Songwriting. Look, I'm a singer and songwriter just like a lot of you, and over the last decade, I've been putting together a series of techniques to help songwriters just like you write a better song. And you know what? I think I'm onto something. Look, if you want to write attention-grabbing, head-bobbing, can't get it out of your head type songs, well then stay tuned. Because in this episode, we're going to discuss steps 1 through 4 of mixing down your final products. Those steps are recording clean vocals, subtractive EQing, setting compression, and setting buses. Look, these tips can definitely be used by anyone and hopefully help you as a songwriter hone your craft on writing a much more solid song. I mean, after all, songwriting is a science. Okay, so let's get started. Step number 1. The very first step in recording a more professional sounding mix is making sure you've recorded clean vocals. So, how do we do that? We do that by using the tool called a comping tool. Now, what a comping tool is, it's a plugin in your DAW that allows you to do multiple recordings within one track for the purpose of going back through each of the tracks and selecting the best possible parts and putting them together for the perfect verse. So what it looks like is this. In each of my tracks, I have an option to engage comping. When I click on the comping icon, it opens up all the tracks underneath. Now, what you do is every time you press record, it'll record each take on a different lane in your track. Then what you do is go through and listen to each lane one at a time and delete the parts you don't like. What you should be left with is the best possible parts of each take. When you're done with that, you can close the comping view and then bounce all your parts down into one cohesive track. So, with that being said, since we last spoke, what I did was went back through everything that we have been working on this far, and I re-recorded everything using the comping tool and giving all of my background vocals at least 4 layers. So, to catch everybody up to speed, this is what we're starting off with. But when I try to pull myself together, even though I know it's hard, but these screws, oh these screws, yeah my screws keep falling. But when I try and catch the pieces, I just keep falling apart. These screws, oh these screws, yeah my screws, they keep falling loose. Alright, so that's where we're at. By using the comping tool, we were able to make sure we had the best possible recording for each verse. So, step number 2, subtractive EQing. Now, a lot of sound engineers have a lot of different ways to EQ their vocals, but me personally, I like a process called subtractive EQing. So, what that looks like is first, you have to open up your EQ mixer. All right, so I'm working with a 4-band EQ. Now, the way subtractive EQing works is while you listen to your vocal, you're trying to isolate a lot of that background noise or that muddy noise and remove it. So, what I'm going to show you is how I go about using subtractive EQing to cleaning up the vocal. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate this verse and then I'm going to play it in solo mode so you can hear how to identify a lot of the mud in the background of the vocal. Here we go. But when I try to pull myself together, even though I know it's hard, but these screws. But when I try and catch the pieces, I just keep falling apart. These screws, oh these screws, yeah my screws, they keep falling loose. Okay, so if you notice, when I raise the high mids, you could hear an obvious manipulation, kind of sounding like I'm singing the verse into a tube or a cup. That's the sound that we want to isolate. So by isolating that sound, we now know where a lot of that mud sits in the vocal so we can subtract it out. So once you find it, you subtract it out by doing this. But when I try to pull myself together, even though I know it's hard, but these screws. But when I try and catch the pieces, I just keep falling apart. These screws, oh, these screws, yeah, my screws, they keep falling loose. Okay, so once you subtracted it out, I usually like to go to about -3 dBs once I've isolated that sound. Then what you want to do is open it up to make sure you get as much of that muddiness out as possible. So once again, I like to open it up to around 3 dBs. So let's see what we got. But when I try to pull myself together, even though I know it's hard, but these screws. But when I try and catch the pieces, I just keep falling apart. These screws, oh, these screws, yeah, my screws, they keep falling loose. All right, now the last thing you want to do is make sure you add a little lift to brighten up the top part of the vocal and a high pass filter to cut off all that low frequency at the end of the vocal. So by doing this, all that low noise is cut out, all the high noise is allowed to pass, high pass filter, and then we're gonna brighten up the top end in order for it to cut through the sound a little more. So let's listen to this all the way through and see what we got. But when I try to pull myself together, even though I know it's hard, but these screws. But when I try and catch the pieces, I just keep falling apart. These screws, oh, these screws, yeah, my screws, they keep falling loose. All right, and there you have it. That is subtractive EQing. The purpose is to isolate the mud in the sound wave and then cut it out so only the clean and crisp vocal still remains and is able to cut through your instrumental much more clearly. Now, using an EQ will probably require a lot of CPU usage. So that takes us to step number 3. The way we save a lot of CPU usage for our plugins is by assigning all of our tracks to buses. So, step number 3, assigning buses. What a bus is, it basically is if you want to get the sound signal to a certain location, you would transport it using a plugin that's similar to a bus, like an actual yellow school bus. Now, on a yellow school bus, you have multiple children going to the same location. Well, a bus is the same way. If you have all of your leads and you want them to all be EQ'd the same way, well, the way you save CPU usage so where you don't have to put an EQ on each of your leads is by EQing on the bus and routing your lead vocals to that bus. So therefore, now you're only running one EQ as opposed to multiple EQs, and it doesn't bog down your computer as much. So how do we assign buses? Let's take a look. Okay, so when I assign my buses, I assign them based off of what I want them to do. So if we look right here, what I did was I went through and I isolated 4 of my ad libs that I would like to be routed to the same bus for the purpose of them all being affected by the same plugin. So, how buses work is like this. First, you have to open up each of the individual tracks and you have to sign those tracks to ascend. Now, after you designate a bus for your first track, then all you have to do is go into the remainders and find the same bus to assign those to. Now I'm gonna go ahead and erase this send because I selected the wrong track. So delete send. So now track 8, 9, 10, and 11 are all routed to the same bus. So what that means is any plug-in I plug in to bus H will be expressed through these 4 tracks. So where do I find bus H? I can find it in my DAW on my master view. So if you see down in my master view, I found bus H. So now any plugins I insert on this track will be expressed through the 4 tracks that I assigned to bus H. So for this purpose, I want to drop in an EQ and EQ out all 4 of those ad-libs so that they complement the lead vocal, so I don't have to EQ each of those tracks individually. Try to catch the pieces, I just keep falling apart. All these screws, they keep falling loose. Try to catch the pieces, I just keep falling apart. And there you have it. I just EQ'd all 4 of these tracks by only using one equalizer. So by putting the equalizer on the bus and routing all the tracks that I want to be affected by that one equalizer to that same bus, it saves me the hassle of EQing each individual track. So, step number 4, compression. What is a compressor? A compressor is kind of like a volume regulator. What it does is it's a tool used to bring up the low parts of your vocal and bring down the high parts of your vocal to almost regulate a consistency in the level of volume throughout your entire vocal. So, how it's used is like this. To use a compressor, first thing you have to do is select a compressor and drag and drop it onto the track or onto the bus that you're trying to compress. So, when using a compressor, there's 3 main areas that you need to focus on. Number 1 is ratio. Number 2 is the input. And number 3 is the output. My rule of thumb when mixing a lot of my songs is I like to keep my ratio around 4:1. And I always try to shoot for having my input match my output. So here we go. But when I try to pull myself together, even though I know it's hard, but these screws. But when I try and catch the pieces, I just keep falling apart. These screws, oh these screws, yeah my screws, they keep falling loose. But when I try to pull myself together, even though I know it's hard, but these screws. But when I try and catch the pieces, I just keep falling apart. These screws, oh these screws, yeah my screws, they keep falling loose. Alright, so if we look here and we notice, I'm at about 8.1 and 8.0 on my input and about 8.3 and 8.3 on my output. That is like the sweet spot. That is where I want to be. So by manipulating your input and your output to be about the same, you put a very moderate reduction on the high parts of the vocal and a nice little boost on the low parts of the vocal to give you a much more consistent sound, a consistent volume throughout your lead. Well, that's all for today's episode. So tell me, how do you go about beginning your mix? Please leave a comment below because I would love to hear some of your techniques. I hope today's episode was helpful. And if you want to hear the finished product of this song now, just click the link in the description below. Also, make sure you subscribe to my channel. In the next episode, we're going to discuss the next 4 steps of the mix. Also, if you want to hear some more of my work, click the link in the description below and it'll take you to listen to songs off of my catalog. And if you want to get your hands on one of these exclusive No Be the Same Entertainment hoodies, once again, click the link in the description below next to merchandise and it'll direct you to the store. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode. And until next time, after all, songwriting is a science.